Hello, and welcome to the summary of events for the second half of Season 1 of saturd&d. This summary is designed to be listened to in conjunction with Episode 0 if you are using them as a way of catching up quicker, but if you are just wishing for a refresher of the events thus far, this should suit your needs. I am the Dungeon Master, Beard, and I am the creative mind behind the machinations that befall our players. Where the last summary left off, the adventurers were in the middle of exploring a cave system beneath Gracklestug. Cultists and Mad Duro harried their every step in the caves as they progressed, until they came upon a room with a mighty, black obelisk and a large, red stone in the shape of an egg. After a brief battle with a lesser beholder and a powerful mage, they set about investigating the room. The red boulder they quickly discovered to be the red dragon egg they had been told to find, hidden down here by the cult that had stolen it from the keepers. The black obelisk, though, was an enigma. Thrumming with power, one of the group touched it, and disappeared altogether. Panicking, the rest of the group investigated, two more of their number disappearing. But strangely, one of the party was able to harness the obelisk's true power just right, teleporting a cart full of various surface goods into the cavern with them. Through investigation and deduction, as well as the use of Sahvra's card, it was discovered that this mysterious obelisk was how the Duro were getting items from the surface so quickly. Able to teleport things if you are strong enough of will from the surface at random, but also able to teleport other objects to other places. Its true power, unfortunately, is not something that the adventurers could take a hold of, nor could any creature within the next few thousand years. The rest of their objectives from the city above found answers in these strange caves as well. Their missing compatriots, though, each found themselves teleported to a random location in town. They were all worried for the rest of the party's thoughts and well-being towards them, having just randomly disappeared. They each ventured back to rejoin their crew. The group still in the cave waited impatiently, worried for the safety of their friends, but not wanting to leave their location if they ended up coming back. Fortunately, it was very near the end of their investigation and Sahvra's use of her magical card that their friends started returning. With their time in the caves completed and all their objectives fulfilled, they left and reported to each person that had tasked them, relaying information and how it was needed. Ilsa was quick to fulfill her end of the bargain, sending off a missive to her contacts in Blingdenstone, as well as giving the party a name of the individuals they were to look for. And with that last matter concluded, there was nothing else tying them to Gracklestug. They made plans for one last night's stay before leaving and delving into the Underdark once more towards a path home. But before the end of the night, Meeps used the power of her card from the dealer, remembering the events that allowed her its use. A great feast was held for them, with more food than they could ever eat, of a higher caliber than they had ever tasted before. Truly, it was a celebration of their journey towards home. After their feast, they retired to their rooms. Only Marx had made his way to Sahvra's. Touched by her stories of her missing wife, he gave Sahvra one of his cards, imploring her to use it to find her missing wife. Grateful and moved by Marx's actions, Sahvra used the power of the card not for herself, but for both of them, wording her desire and question in a way that allowed them both to pay witness to the fates of their loved ones, Val and Song. Sadly, Val's fate was worse than death. Her soul was trapped and tormented, tied to her skull, which was now draped around the neck of Serges, who was on the surface, creating a vast army of vile creatures. But Song, she was alive, somewhere near Darklake. Driven mad and looking near the end of her health, she was stranded somewhere on a rocky shore underground. Filled with resolve, Marx and Sahvra vowed to help each other bring the other to their loved one's rightful rest they deserved. Their final rest in town finished, the party awoke and left town. A much easier road was before them, or so they thought. The dangers on this side of Dark Lake were stronger and deadlier than ever before, Sahvra nearly losing her life to a group of drow that had been searching and waiting for them. With a reminder of how perilous their journey was to them, they continued. It was decided back in Gracklestug that they would journey towards Neverlight Grove, the home of the Myconids, Stool and Rumpadump, where their companions could finally return to their loved ones, as it was on the way to Blingdenstone. During their journey, they ran into a very strange group of bloodthirsty gnolls who seemed to be hunting a group of creatures, but these gnolls were so bloodthirsty and rabid that they attacked the party on sight. The rest of the journey towards Neverlight was filled with caution and careful planning, a desire to avoid a repeat of Sahvra's close call. All the while, Xeara's nightmares slowly grew in frequency and intensity. Marx constantly hunted and killed. Upon arriving at Neverlight, an air of unease surrounded the group. Something didn't sit right with them about this village, and this was reflected in Rumpadump and Stool being nervous as well. They were quickly greeted by the two village elders, Philo and Basidia. Philo seemed to sway to an unheard tune, while Basidia seemed to distance itself from Philo, wary of its intentions, invitations, and attitude. Once Philo had left, Basidia warned the adventurers that something sinister and strange was happening in the village. Traditions and normalities were being upturned and uprooted, changed into something mimicking mortal things and customs. This was wrong and strange to Basidia, especially since Philo and those loyal to it were keeping the rest of the Myconids from visiting the holy fungus groves in the back of their caverns, always talking about some sort of ceremony that was coming. Basidia implored them to leave as soon as possible, but if they ventured deeper into the cavern where it could not, it would reward the group in exchange for telling Basidia what was going on with its fellow Myconids. Most of the group wanted to leave immediately, but the few that wished to stay and help their friends, Rumpadump and Stool, eventually convinced the others to at least investigate from afar. And so they ventured into the village. Stealthily, they made their way through the grove until they reached that forbidden area. There, it quickly became apparent that they were dealing with something far more evil and sinister than they had initially thought. Half-buried corpses, covered in moldy and festering pustules moaning in undeath, rotting piles of myconid bodies that had melded into larger entities of vileness, and a gruesome procession of corpses, animated by a sinister fungus singing and dancing about, cheering about a fetid wedding. The party quickly made their escape, but not without a number of their group becoming infected with maddening spores, their demeanor shifting greatly and unpleasantly. They also witnessed the final moments of their old companion, Sereth, his body mostly fungus, moaning in pain and torment unending, half buried in mushrooms and fungus. Warning Basidia of the horrors that awaited those faithful to it, the party fled Neverlight Grove and its nightmarish atrocities with all haste, Basidia promising to follow suit with those few that were still untainted. A dour mood overtook the party when their companions finally regained their senses, the horrific visions and sights they beheld burning in their mind, refreshing the nightmarish scene of Demogorgon rising from Dark Lake. Another demon lord had made itself known to them. This time, it was most assuredly Zugtmoy, the Lady of Fungi, the demon queen of rot and decay. Portents that did not bode well when counted with the rest of the madness and atrocities they had experienced and seen in the Underdark these past 2 months. But still, they pressed on towards Blingdenstone, and the promise of sunlight once more. Taking care once more, after significant distance was between them and Neverlight Grove, their path was interrupted by a sudden cave-in. Blocking both the path ahead and behind, they had to delve their way into a strange set of ruins that the cave-in had revealed. These ruins were wet, damp, with pools of water that were slowly getting bigger. But the strangest thing was also in this ruin. They met an intelligent, telepathic, gelatinous cube who called itself Globagool. He was extremely curious about the adventurers, asking all sorts of questions about them, their attire, their adventures, and the world outside the ruins he had been trapped in for as long as he could remember. With Globagool's help, they avoided a few slimes and oozes, venturing deeper into the ruins, only to find that they were sealed in, and an inescapable dead end awaited them, with no exit in sight from the ruins. Quick and clever thinking led the party to break open the largest leak that was flooding the ruins in the roof of one of the rooms, making the water torrent into the room even faster. But now the opening was big enough for them each to climb up the shaft of rushing water. The water had to be coming from somewhere. Burning lungs and tired arms and legs threatened the group as they climbed their way through the rushing water, until, thankfully, their heads broke the surface of the water. They found themselves in a slow, calm river, and decided to make camp and dry off on its shores, speaking to and learning about their new, fast, curious friend, Globagool. Once more, they continued their journey through the Underdark, towards Blingdenstone, aided by the twins Topsy and Turvy, who had started to recognize the path home. As they were nearing their destination, they came upon a group of deep gnomes who were struggling with a cart full of metal ore, the metal axle and wheel irreparably damaged. Aiding this group and exchanging introductions, they exchanged an armed escort for these deep gnomes towards town, for ease of entry into the untrusting city of Blingdenstone. Tensions were high in town, they were told, but the names of the contacts they were given by Ilsa were known to these gnomes, and were assured that they would be able to meet them, should they continue their escort. Deciding it was best, they asked Globagool to stay outside the city for his own safety. Indeed, once the party maneuvered through the heavily defended gates and found themselves in this city proper of Blingdenstone, tensions felt high. But they quickly made their way to talk to those they were told to, the Diggermatics. Quickly, the party learned that Dorbo and Senny Diggermatic were actually the de facto leaders of Blingdenstone, and after a private audience was acquired, the details of their journey and destination were laid bare to the two deep gnomes. Unfortunately, after regaling their tale, the party was told that the Diggermatics were unable to help. All hands were on deck, so to speak, to deal with multiple threats that were growing and causing concern to the common folk who could not fight. There was the threat of a were-rat tribe nearby, which the Diggermatics were very recognized as having different opinions on. Also, there was a strange entity that was causing all of the Earth Elemental defenders to go crazy and wild, breaking free of their summoner's control, disallowing their use in the city. This entity was somewhere in the quarantined section of the destroyed half of the city. Yet another issue they were experiencing was the fact that oozes and slimes were converging on the city from all directions, and the reasons for such was a mystery and a cause for great concern. The creatures could fit through cracks in rocks and stone that no other living creature could, so defense against them was nigh impossible. Plagued with these issues, the Diggermatics were unable to help unless something changed, and they made headway with their problems. Hopefully soon. Debating between themselves, the party resolved to help the Diggermatics as much as possible if it meant safe passage to the surface. The Diggermatics agreed, promising the use of a guide and a private, safe, straight path to within a single day's journey of the surface. No dangers of the Underdark to worry about, just an easy, straight shot towards freedom from an unending dark. Emboldened by this prospect, the group ventured into the city, towards the inn where they were told they could find room and board. Along the way, Jimjar and the twins found themselves homes in the housing district nearby, or at least temporary living situations for the twins, as they wished to see how the were-rat issue was resolved, being ones themselves. An experience almost identical to a luxurious inn awaited them here in the Foaming Mug Inn. Hot springs, much better meals than anything they'd experienced in the last 3 months, and an excitable and curious innkeeper were their very welcome companions. A night of sleep was just what they needed to recuperate from their journey and prepare them for their missions on the morrow. Upon waking, the party went out into the town to resupply and gain information on their objectives. Strangely, though, Jimjar was gone, as well as the entire hovel he had claimed as his own home. In their place was a single coin with the image of Jimjar, winking and smiling emblazoned upon it, which Meeps took into her possession. Even stranger was the fact that the other members of the party did not recall ever traveling with a bald, cheerful deep gnome, aside from Xeara, Sahvra, Rubin, Marx, and Meeps. As deeply puzzling as this was, the party resupplied and began their investigation into the were-rats in the closed-off section of the city. Once the door behind them was closed and locked, the party was quickly set upon by a group of were-rat attackers. Just as quickly as they appeared, after receiving a greater blow than they dealt, the were-rats ran, fleeing into the dark of the caverns. It wasn't much longer that the party found their way through the caves, coming upon a larger band of were-rats. These individuals, all deep gnomes similar in look to Topsy and Turvy, demanded to know why the outsiders were there and their intentions. After parleying, the party was brought before the leader of the were-rats, one Chipgrin Goldwhisker, head of the Goldwhisker clan of were-rats here in Blingdenstone. A larger fellow, he only wished for the well-being of his peoples, and for the prejudice against them to come to an end. They were not wild beasts to defend against and fear, but fellow deep gnomes, ones that had been in Blingdenstone before the Diggermatics had arrived to reclaim the long-abandoned city, in fact. With this message, the group returned to Dorbo and Senni, where plans for peace began, and an understanding started. Senni's desire for peace and understanding had won over Dorbo's desire for eradication and protection. Soon after, the party informed the twins that it was safe with the Goldwhiskers, that they could finally find a place that they could call home and be safe. Thanking the group for all that they had done, the twins finally parted ways with the party, choosing to live the rest of their lives here in Blingdenstone. The issue of the were-rats concluded, the party ventured out into the other half of the section-off city, where darkness reigned and strange noises echoed around them. Their foray was brief, though, as they were quickly beset upon by ghastly wraiths. The battle was short, but not without its toll. Rubin had been magically aged to a man in his 70s in the blink of an eye. Fearing for their companions' sanity and safety, the party retreated back to town, searching for a powerful cleric in the local clergy. For a rather expensive fee, which was needed for the base components of the spell, Rubin was thankfully restored to his previous age. Mentally shaken and compromised, though, Rubin refused to continue into the adventure, choosing instead to let his party continue without him while he recovered from the horrific experience of suddenly losing more than half his time in the world. Leaving Rubin behind to rest and recuperate in the inn, the party ventured forth once more, coming eventually upon the strange entity that was causing the deep gnome's earth elements to rampage. It was a strange, otherworldly wind of dust and stone that harassed them, bringing stone statues to life to fight them. Thinking quickly, Sahvra banished the entity, forcing it back into its home plane of existence. Investigating the abandoned city further, they came upon a horrific sight. Hundreds upon hundreds of slimes, oozes, jellies, and cubes were congregating in the deepest part of the city, an otherworldly voice echoing through the cavern as they traveled. The voice proclaimed itself the Pudding King, and that the enemies of Lord Juiblex would be punished and destroyed. The sheer numbers of enemies far greater than they could ever handle alone, the party returned, relaying all they had found to the Diggermatics. A plan was quickly formulated by the couple. They would gather what arms and armaments they could, calling upon allies nearby, and mount an assault on this Pudding King and his army. Asking for the party's aid once more, the plan for preparation was set in motion. A single caravan was sent, armed and armored, to visit both Neverlight Grove for fungi and mushrooms and lichen that would be used to coat weapons and armor to prevent acidic decay from the slimes and oozes, and also to retrieve said arms and armaments from their contacts in Gracklestug. Warned prior of the horrific events that took place in Neverlight Grove, the caravan would take all precautions and avoid as much of the Myconids and village proper as they could, sticking to the outskirts for their supplies. While the caravan made the week-long trip, the party was sent back into the Underdark to find a site of summoning, lost since the city was last inhabited hundreds of years ago. This site could be used to summon earth elementals, now that the threat of the loss of control was gone. They would be stronger and under better control, being summoned in this site of power, a powerful boon in their fight with the Pudding King. Relatively speaking, it was fairly easy finding the site. The path was winding, confusing, and the party ventured in circles more than once, the tunnels being carved into a confusing labyrinth on purpose for defense, but eventually, the site was found, and a proper path back to the city was charted. Upon returning to the city, the Diggermatics made all preparations they could for the coming assault. Globagool was introduced to the Diggermatics as an ally and friend. Scouts and Globagool were sent into enemy territory, and soldiers were equipped. The plan was devised. They would assault the front of the enemy's territory, drawing much of the defenders, but it would just be a front. The adventurers would be escorted through a little-known path in the back of the city, which led almost directly to the lair where the Pudding King had decided to take residence. Upon his defeat, the adventurers would send a signal to the front lines, and there would be a massive retreat. The escort would still be waiting to take the party back to safety, and the army at the front lines would fall back to defensible positions. With the leader and controller of the creatures defeated and gone, the hope was that the far less intelligent slimes would eventually disperse, or at the very least, be easier to defeat in combat, unorganized as they would be. Unbelievably, the aid of Globagool had been indispensable. Being a gelatinous cube himself, much of their intelligence had been gathered from the kindly creature, as it ventured deeper into the depths of enemy territory than anyone else could. And so, the plan was executed to the letter, the assault drawing the full force of the Pudding King's army while the party slipped in the back, assaulting the king himself in combat. Eventually, cornered and wounded, the putrescent form of a deep gnome that the Pudding King was wearing melted, showing a writhing mass of ooze and jelly, but the group was soon victorious completely. As the vile creature that was the Pudding King melted into nothingness, it let loose one last cry that its lord, the demon lord Jewyblex, the faceless lord slime of oozes and shapeless things, would exact his revenge on the interlopers, for his power was immeasurable and unknowable. The Pudding King finally defeated, a war horn sounded from the front lines, and retreat began, but not before the group was able to find treasures hidden in the throne room of the deposed king. Returning to the city proper of Blingdenstone, with losses smaller than even the most hopeful of theories, a celebration to end all celebrations was held. The party learned that the moment the Pudding King was defeated was apparent. The Deep Gnome's foe immediately lost all coordination and began wandering aimlessly once more. All sense of intelligence reverted to that which it should have been in the first place. But, more importantly, plans were put into place for the party's return to the surface the next day. The celebrations that followed were ones that would be remembered for a lifetime. Retiring to the inn, though, their final night in town was less than enjoyable. For some of them. Xeara had nightmares, horrific and constant, their grip tightening as they neared the surface. And for Sahvra, one of the treasures they had found in the Pudding King's court was a polished eye, which had been turned into an intensely powerful scrying crystal. Her desire to see her wife was too great a temptation, and Sahvra peered into the magic of the crystal, finally seeing her wife for the first time in 6 years. Disheveled, malnourished, and on the brink of complete madness, her wife was still on the shore of Dark Lake somewhere, barely continuing on. This almost broke Sahvra, who spent hours repeating the scry over and over just to watch her wife sleep fitfully. When she could take it no longer, she finally decided to move on, and Sahvra scried on her last known handler, Davra. This scry played out much differently than the previous. Her scry was immediately discovered by an unknown entity known only as Dreadlord Jaspar. The man seemed to know much and more about Sahvra than was to be expected, almost seemingly communicating through the scry spell directly with Sahvra's mind. A horrific mental assault from this unseen assailant is halted just as fast as it happens, as it seems to read her entire mind in a single instant. A superior, far higher in the Zentarum than anyone else she had ever met, and obviously more powerful than any other creature she had met. The promise of a direct meeting and report was made, and her scry was forcibly terminated. Deciding that this was more than enough prying into things she shouldn't be, Sahvra did her best to sleep that night. It came, but was fitful, unpleasant, and was all too short. Waking the next day, Sahvra shared her findings with her friends, who each wished for her to use the orb to check on those they loved. For Xeara, it was her birth parents. A scene of malnutrition and servitude showed itself to Sahvra. They were alive, but only enough to continue their life in slavery. For Meeps, it was also her parents. Far across the ocean, her homeland had endured a horrible attack from a mysterious force of Duergar with two heads. Many were dead, and the royal family and political rulings were in disarray. Though her parents' safety was verified, her home being in turmoil left a sour taste in Meeps' mouth. And for Marx, it was Serges. He was a horrific sight. 10 feet tall, a second head on his shoulders, screaming at a congregation of thousands of vile creatures as far as the eye could see in a language unknown to her. A growing threat to the safety of the land above. With these visions spurring their resolve, they left the city of Blingmanstone behind. The next 3 days of travel were through a single corridor, carved from the rock, with no other tunnels branching from its path. No threats or trials or tribulations they came across, their guide easily disabling any unseen traps and safeguards without their knowing. And once they were free from the corridor, the most wonderful thing came to their senses. A barely noticeable scent of fresh dirt and grass wafting down the dark, damp tunnels. Only a single day of travel from the surface, they were told. And so they rested underground one last time. Waking, they made ready for the one last day of travel. As they neared the surface, the smell of foliage, dirt, mud, sunlight, and wood grew stronger and stronger. But all was not as easy as they thought they would be. For as they rounded a bend, an impossibly thick wall of web lay before them, a sinister voice ringing out from behind. Ilvara had been waiting. For months she had pursued them. At first, it was to bring them back to heel as the slaves they were. But now she wished only to destroy them utterly, their lives forfeit in her mind from the trouble they had caused and the humiliation they had brought her and her house. And so, her force made ready to destroy the party. The battle that ensued was intense and harrowing. Might, both magical and physical, was thrown across the battlefield on both sides. There was no mercy from either side. Every attack, every spell, was aimed at death and destruction, the culmination of 3 months underground, and freedom being within sight, fueled the party in their fight. And finally, with one final curse of rage from Sahvra, Ilvara fell. A surge of lightning cast straight through her entire body, charring her into nothingness, as well as another soldier behind her, as Sahvra loosed one of the largest spells she could muster, from point blank. The greatest threat destroyed, the rest of the force was dispatched shortly after. There were no survivors among the drow. As the dust settled, and wounds were treated and mended, the friends, no, the family, looked to each other once more. and they set to work on the webs, barring their way. Slashing, hacking, and burning, all with joyful smiles on their faces. With every web that fell, the light at the end of the tunnel grew, the fresh, loamy scent of the surface world filling their nostrils. And as the last of the webs fell, they ran around the corner ahead. They finally stopped as their world turned white from the brilliance of the sun. Months without sunlight made itself evident in the now searing pain in their eyes, but oh did they welcome it, as well as the sounds of the world above. But that was not the only sound they heard. Voices, chanting, stomping, screaming, all slowly dying as their eyes adjusted to the sunlight, until the sight before them became known. A veritable sea of creatures, great and small, all adorned for war, covered in spikes and bones, stared up at them from the small valley they found themselves in. Hundreds, no, easily 1,000 or more creatures, evil and vile, lay before them. And at their head, only a few hundred yards from them, was the massive, 10-foot-tall, two-headed form of Serges, the head of this horrible army. Quickly surrounded by his minions, Serges gloated. Marx's blood was all that he required for total power from his master, and the destruction of the Amazons would be assured. And so a challenge to the death was thrown at Marx's feet. Standing proudly, his shoulders square and his head held high, Marx stepped forward, accepting the fight he knew not if he could win. But it was his destiny. Win or lose, his soul knew without a doubt that his people, his Vol, deserved the chance of this creature's destruction. And so the throng of creatures separated, leaving a large open field where the two would battle. Jeers and sneers met Marx as he strode towards Serges, his companions kept back by the sheer number of enemies. Xeara was inconsolable. Her greatest fear was coming to fruition, and she was powerless to stop it. But Sahvra, Rubin, and Meeps had other ideas. Whispering amongst themselves, they made ready to join the fight at the first opportunity, even if it meant fighting hundreds of creatures to arrive at their brother's side. But as Marx drew his weapon, he pulled a card from his pocket. Turning towards his friends, he smiled, holding the card aloft. I wish for my friends to be transported to safety, away from this horrible fight. The power of his wish burned forth from the card, encasing his screaming allies in a silvery golden light. They were lifted from the ground, their protests echoing in Marx's ears as he turned to face his foe. But his friends were not transported far. Floating there, 50 feet in the air, they felt themselves transported to the world between worlds, the thin veil that separates the material from the immaterial, the ethereal plane. There they were trapped, forced to watch their companion fight a being of pure evil and chaos to the death. And so, the fight ensued. Serges and Marx exchanged blows, each one cutting the other deeply. There was no regard for their safety, a test of pure endurance and might. But for every wound Marx inflicted on Serges, 2 would find themselves on his own body. A gloating and gleeful Serges seemed unfazed by Marx's attempts at harm. His wounds oozed a vile, black liquid, but his heads screamed in triumph as blow after blow continued to bring Marx lower and lower, while Serges continued to stand. Eventually, it finally became too much for Marx's body to bear. Falling to one knee, blood pouring from countless wounds in his flesh, he felt his life leaving his body. His soul protested, begged his body to respond, but the flesh refused. Unheard, his friends hammered against the side of the strange bubble they were in, separated from their companion and forced to watch him suffer and die, powerless to help. But as Serges raised his weapon high for one final blow, Val's skull glowed golden before exploding around his neck. Using the last essence of her spirit still trapped in this world, Val's soul embraced Marx. healing his wounds and filling his body with the strength and resolve that his soul still held. Reaching down, Marx lifted his weapon from the dirt, standing once more as Sergus's supposed final blow slammed into his chest. But there was no wound. Protected by the ancestors before him, and the love from and for Vol, Marx's body stood unaffected. Blow after blow came from Sergus to no avail. Met by each of his own blows, Marx's weapon drove deep into Sergus's body, flesh tearing asunder, wounds pouring forth a blackened substance that no mortal could call blood. And finally, with one last cry of vengeance, justice, and triumph, Marx ended the creature that called itself Sergus. Both heads falling into the dirt, body crumpling and dissolving into a boiling mass of blackened ooze, the entire congregation of 1,000 and more creatures suddenly fell silent. The last words from Sergus's heads was a plea for his master, Demogorgon, for the power to rise once more. But his plea seemingly fell on uncaring ears, as the last of his flesh melted into gore, dissolving into ash and blowing away in the wind. Then came the screams of terror. Their master, the strongest among them, destroyed before their very eyes, the 1,000 and more creatures fled, fear and self-preservation the only thing their minds could comprehend. Planting the end of his weapon in the ground and sighing a contented sigh, Marx felt the presence of Vol once more as her soul embraced his, grasping tightly as she whispered softly in his ears, "Marx the Triumphant." As her soul left him, finally free to depart the material realm and pass on, the golden light left his body, coalescing on the broken dagger pendant around his neck. Shining brightly, the light faded, revealing a fully repaired necklace. As his body's strength finally left him and he fell backwards, his companions finally were freed from their strange imprisonment. Gently placed on the ground, the bubble around them popped as they returned to their own realm. Screaming in fright, joy, sorrow, and exhilaration, they joined Marx on the ground, hugging each other tightly and lovingly. And, as they watched the sun climb higher in the sky, they knew that their new family would be together, no matter what they would experience in the future. For a family is that which you choose, that which you cultivate in your heart, and such bonds cannot be undone by malicious forces, and are stronger than any other bond. And that is all that was written for the first part of our adventurer story. A story full of hardship, love, sorrow, and learning, but more importantly, it is a story they shaped themselves, together. As a group of friends just wishing to have some fun on the weekends, this story grew from their choices and their wants and experiences. Though before I go for this summary, I implore you, if you have enjoyed these summaries or any of our adventures in their entirety so far, go back and give a listen to episodes 17 and 18. That is truly where this story developed into something more than just a weekly game session of D&D. Thank you for being here, for listening to this big dumb nerd talking for such a long time, and for sharing in this story with us. I look forward to bringing more exciting adventures to you in the future. Look forward to the next videos that continue the story into Season 2, or for even the final summary at the end of those. Thank you again, and goodbye.